Julian Thorne existed in a world of polished glass and muted acoustics. From his penthouse office, the city of Chicago sprawled below, a silent, glittering carpet of ambition and struggle that rarely touched him. His universe was one of quarterly reports, hostile takeovers, and the relentless, humming silence of immense wealth. He was the CEO of Thorne Industries, a titan of logistics and engineering, a man whose name on a contract could shift markets. But inside the bespoke suit and behind the cool, gray eyes, Julian was an empire of one, ruling over a kingdom of grief. His wife, Amelia, had been gone for 2 years and she had taken all the color from his world with her. His days were a metronome of efficiency. 7 a.m. workout, 8 a.m. market briefing, 9 a.m. to 7 p.m. a series of boardrooms and video calls where he moved billion-dollar assets with the emotional investment of a man playing chess. He drove a silver Aston Martin, not for the thrill, but because it was a quiet, ruthlessly effective machine, much like himself. Tonight, he was steering it through rush-hour traffic, a place he rarely found himself. A merger was on the line, a colossal deal that would cement his legacy. His phone buzzed with an urgent summons from his legal team, but he ignored it. An unfamiliar restlessness had taken root in him today, a splinter of unease he couldn't dislodge. The unease led him here, to a manicured suburban street far from his downtown spire. He was acting on a whim, a ghost of a promise made to his late wife. Amelia had been passionate about people, about connections. One of her favorite people had been Sarah Vance, the wife of a gifted Thorne Industries engineer named David. Amelia had gushed about their warmth, their intelligence, their 2 beautiful children. Then, a year ago, tragedy had struck. A car accident. Both David and Sarah gone. Julian had approved the company's generous settlement package, signed the condolence card his assistant prepared, and moved on. But Amelia's voice echoed in his memory, a gentle chiding about his detachment. Today, on the anniversary of her own passing, the guilt was a physical weight. He had to see if the children were okay. He had to do this one thing for her. He found the address. It was a large, imposing brick house belonging to the children's guardians, an uncle and aunt named Croft. Pulling up to the curb, he felt a stab of self-consciousness. He should have called. This was an intrusion. But as he debated driving away, the front door opened, and a man with a practiced, welcoming smile stepped out. He was impeccably dressed, looking every bit the part of a successful suburban patriarch. "Mr. Thorne?" he called out, his eyes widening in recognition. "What a surprise. Marcus Croft. Please come in. We were just sitting down to dinner." The invitation was slick, leaving no room for refusal. Julian, a master of controlling situations, found himself suddenly being managed. Inside, the house was opulent but cold. A long mahogany table dominated the dining room, laden with food. A woman with sharp features and expensive jewelry, whom Marcus introduced as his wife Beatrice, offered a tight smile. 2 small children, a boy and a girl with identical, soulful brown eyes, sat at the far end of the table, looking small and lost. And then Julian saw her. A young woman, barely out of her teens, was moving silently around the table, refilling water glasses, her movements efficient and subservient. She was thin, with the same brown eyes as the children, but hers were clouded with a deep, weary exhaustion. Marcus introduced her with a wave of his hand. "And that's our niece, Alara." Julian was offered a seat, and the meal began. The Crofts talked animatedly about a recent trip to Europe, about their son's acceptance into a prestigious university. All the while, Alara stood against the wall, a silent sentinel in a worn-out cardigan. The children, Liam and Lily, picked at their small portions, their eyes darting nervously towards their aunt and uncle. Julian watched the scene, a strange disconnect forming in his mind. The lavish spread, the boisterous conversation, and the 3 silent, watchful figures at the periphery. It was a performance, and he was the audience. He saw Marcus heap a second serving of roast beef onto his plate while Lily's was still nearly empty. He saw Beatrice snap at Liam for fidgeting. And he saw Alara standing, waiting, her posture one of utter resignation. The sight gnawed him. In his world, every person in a room had a purpose, a position. Her position seemed to be that of a ghost. Finally, he could no longer abide the silence, the sheer wrongness of it all. He placed his fork down, the clink loud in a momentary lull in the conversation. He looked directly at Marcus, then gestured with his head towards the young woman by the wall. "Why isn't she eating too?" A profound, brittle silence fell over the table. Marcus's smile faltered. Beatrice's eyes narrowed into slits of ice. The children froze, their forks hovering in midair. It was Beatrice who answered, her voice dripping with condescension. "Elara eats later," she said, as if explaining something to a simpleton. "In the kitchen." With the staff, she said the word staff as if they didn't have any, as if Elara herself was the entire category. The cruelty was so casual, so blatant, it was like a physical blow. Before Julian could respond, the little boy, Liam, spoke up, his voice a small, clear pipe in the suffocating quiet. "Elara is always hungry," he whispered. The words hung in the air, an irrefutable accusation. The facade of the happy, benevolent family shattered into a million pieces. Julian looked from the boy's earnest, worried face to Elara's, where a single, silent tear was tracing a path down her cheek. He saw the flash of fury in Beatrice's eyes and the panic in Marcus's. He had stumbled into something dark and deeply wrong. The billion-dollar merger, the phone calls from his lawyers, the entire glittering edifice of his life, it all felt utterly meaningless. He was a man who prided himself on seeing every angle, on understanding every variable. And here, in this suffocatingly perfect dining room, he had seen the one thing he could never stomach, the casual, systemic cruelty of the strong against the weak. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Thank you for the meal," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "I have to leave." He didn't wait for a reply, turning his back on the wreckage of the evening and walking out, the little boy's words echoing in his soul. The drive back to his penthouse was a blur. The city lights smeared across his vision, no longer a symbol of power but a testament to the millions of hidden stories, the silent struggles playing out in rooms just like the one he had fled. He strode into his vast, empty apartment, the silence that was once his comfort now feeling accusatory. He ripped off his tie, pacing the length of the floor-to-ceiling windows, the image of Elara's tear-streaked face burned into his mind. "Elara is always hungry." The child's words were a chisel, chipping away at the marble facade he had built around his heart. He thought of Amelia. She would have seen it instantly. She would have felt the wrongness in the air the moment she stepped into that house. She wouldn't have waited until dinner, she would have swept those children and their sister out of there without a second thought. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. He had failed her. He had let his grief and his work become an excuse for a profound and selfish blindness. He was a powerful man, a man who could command armies of lawyers and analysts, yet he hadn't noticed the suffering of the very people his wife had cherished. A memory surfaced, sharp and clear. Amelia, sitting on their sun-drenched balcony, a laptop open. She had been setting up a trust for the Vance children after their parents' death. He remembered her frustration. "Marcus seems off," she had mused aloud, frowning at the screen. "He's being so difficult about the paperwork. It's like he doesn't want me to secure the children's future." At the time, Julian had dismissed it as a minor annoyance, telling her to let the lawyers handle it. Now, her words were a warning siren from the grave. Driven by a new, urgent purpose, Julian went to the spare room where he kept the few boxes of Amelia's things he couldn't bear to part with. He found the one labeled personal files and tore it open. Inside, beneath neatly filed warranties and old receipts, was a smaller, leather-bound box. He opened it. It was a memory box filled with photos. There was Amelia, her arms slung around a vibrant, laughing woman, Sarah Vance. There was another of David Vance, holding a baby Elara, his face beaming with pride. They were pictures of a family full of life and love, a stark, painful contrast to the pinched, fearful faces of the children at the dinner table. And then he found it. A folded piece of notepaper. On it, in Amelia's elegant script, was a short, scribbled memo, "Call Legal Re, Vance Trust." Marcus pushing back on independent oversight. Something's not right. Why is he managing David's corporate death benefit directly? The next morning, his phone rang. It was Marcus Croft. His voice was a slick bomb of feigned concern and apology. "Julian, my friend. I can't apologize enough for last night. Beatrice was on edge. And Elara, well, the girl can be quite sullen. It's a challenge, taking in your relative's children. She's not as grateful as one would hope." The excuses were so transparent, so patently false, that they made Julian's blood run cold. He listened, his grip tightening on the phone, the polished lies only strengthening his resolve. "It was an unfortunate situation," Julian replied, his voice carefully neutral. "I understand." He ended the call, the pretense of civility feeling like acid on his tongue. The moment the line was dead, he made another call. Not to his legal team, but to a number he hadn't used in years. "Arthur," he said when the gruff voice answered. Arthur Vance was his former head of security, a retired Special Forces operative who now ran a private investigation firm that was brutally efficient and pathologically discreet. "I have a job for you. It's personal. Julian's voice was low and intense. I want you to look into a man named Marcus Croft. His finances, his business dealings, everything. I also want you to find every piece of paper related to the deaths of David and Sarah Vance. And I want to know what happened to a trust fund and a corporate death benefit that was supposed to go to their children. Spare no expense, Arthur. I want to know everything. And I want it yesterday. 3 days later, Arthur requested an in-person meeting. It was a sign of the gravity of his findings. They met in a sterile, soundproof conference room at Thorn Industries. Arthur, a man of few words, laid a thin file on the polished table. "It's worse than you thought," he said, his face grim. "The trust fund my wife set up is almost gone," Julian stated, a cold certainty in his gut. "Gone is the right word," Arthur confirmed. "Drained over the last year through a series of shell corporations, all leading back to offshore accounts owned by Marcus Croft." He paused, letting the weight of the theft sink in. "But that's not the half of it. I pulled the initial accident report on the Vances. Then I pulled the service records for their vehicle. The brake lines were tampered with, Julian. It was expertly done. Made to look like wear and tear, but it was sabotage." Julian felt the air leave his lungs. This wasn't just greed. It was something far more monstrous. "Why?" he whispered. Arthur slid a final document across the table. It was a copy of an old internal memo from Thorn Industries dated the week before David Vance's death. It was a whistleblower report authored by David himself. He was flagging massive financial irregularities and safety shortcuts on a major construction project. David Vance was about to expose a multi-million-dollar fraud scheme, Arthur said quietly. A scheme that would have sent the man in charge to prison for a very long time. He tapped a name on the bottom of the memo, the project manager who had signed off on every fraudulent invoice. The name was Marcus Croft. The knowledge was a physical weight settling deep in Julian's bones. This was not a family dispute he had stumbled upon. It was the scene of a crime that had been covered up with horrific precision, a crime that had been born within the walls of his own company. The children, Liam and Lily, and their sister Alara were not just orphans, they were survivors living in the house of the man who had stolen their parents, their security, and their future. The cold fury that had been simmering within him now ignited into a white-hot flame of purpose. He would not just help them. He would get justice for them. He knew he couldn't simply storm the Crofts' fortress and rescue the children. Marcus was clever and ruthless. A direct confrontation without unshakable proof and a solid plan would only endanger Alara and the children more. He needed to get closer, to understand their daily lives, to become a protective presence without revealing his hand. He needed to enter their world. His opportunity came from an unlikely source, a flyer he saw tacked to a bulletin board at a local coffee shop. The children's elementary school, Northwood Elementary, was trying to raise funds to rebuild its ancient, splinter-ridden playground. It was the perfect pretext. He called his foundation, instructed them to make a massive, anonymous donation that would cover the entire project, with one condition: he wanted to volunteer his time on the construction oversight committee. He claimed an interest in community architecture, a plausible hobby for a man like him. The school, overwhelmed by the donation, agreed immediately. His first day as a volunteer felt surreal. He traded his $5,000 suit for jeans and a simple work jacket. He stood on the muddy field behind the school, blueprints in hand, surrounded by cheerful parent volunteers. It was a world away from his sterile boardrooms. And then he saw her. Alara was pulling her beat-up sedan to the curb, letting Liam and Lily out. The children ran towards the school gates, but Alara lingered, her eyes scanning the new activity on the playground. She looked tired, her shoulders slumped with a weariness that went far beyond physical exhaustion. Over the next week, Julian immersed himself in the project, but his real work was observation. He saw the small, heartbreaking details of their hardship. He saw Alara hand the children a single apple sliced in two for their afternoon snack. He saw that Lily's coat was too small, the sleeves ending well above her wrists. He saw the way Liam's shoes were held together with duct tape. He once saw Beatrice Croft drop them off in her gleaming new SUV, not even bothering to get out, simply honking the horn until the children scurried out of the car. He overheard two mothers whispering by the fence. "It's a shame," one said. "The Crofts live like kings, and those poor children look like they're from a Dickens novel. And that older girl, their sister, she looks like a ghost." Each observation was a fresh twist of the knife of his own guilt. This was the reality his inattention had allowed to fester. He began to find small ways to interact with the children. He noticed Liam staring forlornly at a toy dump truck in the sandbox, its wheel broken. Julian, who hadn't worked with his hands in decades, sat down on the edge of the sandbox. "Looks like you've got an axle problem," he said gently. He spent 20 minutes with the boy, using a piece of wire from the construction site and a multi-tool from his car to fashion a surprisingly effective repair. Liam's eyes lit up with a hero worship that felt more rewarding than any successful merger. With Lily, he found a different connection. She was a quiet, dreamy child who loved to draw. He asked her about her drawings of swirling galaxies and distant planets. He told her about the constellations, a hobby he'd once shared with Amelia. Slowly, tentatively, the children began to open up to him. They started looking for his car in the mornings, waving enthusiastically when they saw him. They would run up to him during recess to show him a found rock or a finished drawing. Alara watched all of this from a distance, her expression a mixture of suspicion and confusion. She couldn't understand why this incredibly wealthy, powerful man was spending his days on a muddy school playground. Her caution was a wall around her, thick and high, and Julian knew he had to earn the right to scale it. The moment of truth came unexpectedly. Julian had been reviewing the playground designs on his phone and swiped past a photo on his lock screen. It was the last picture he had taken with Amelia, both of them smiling on a trip to the coast. Lily, who had approached him silently, pointed a small finger at the screen. "That's Auntie Amelia," she exclaimed, her voice full of surprise and recognition. Julian's heart stopped. He had forgotten how close Amelia had been to them. Lily then reached under the collar of her worn-out dress and pulled out a delicate silver chain. On it was a small, heart-shaped locket. "She gave me this," Lily said proudly. "She said it would always keep me safe." It was the same locket he had seen in the photographs from Amelia's memory box. As he was trying to process this, Liam came and stood beside his sister. He wasn't looking at the phone. He was looking directly at Julian, his gaze unnervingly perceptive. "You have sad eyes," Liam said, his voice soft but clear. Just like Alara, the innocent observation struck Julian with the force of a physical confession. The boy saw past the wealth, past the power, and saw the grief that had hollowed him out, the same grief he saw in his sister. Alara had witnessed the exchange from the school gate. She saw the locket. She heard her brother's words. The dam of her suspicion finally broke. She strode across the grass, her posture no longer slumped but rigid with confrontation. She stopped in front of him, her arms crossed, her chin high. The exhaustion was still there, but now it was fueled by a fierce, protective fire. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice low and tense. "You're not just a volunteer. You knew our Aunt Amelia. You're Julian Thorne." Her saying his name wasn't a question. It was an accusation. "Why are you really here, Mr. Thorne?" Marcus and Beatrice Croft were not fools. They were insulated by their wealth and social standing, but the sudden, persistent presence of a man like Julian Thorne at their ward's humble elementary school was a blaring alarm bell. Marcus, a man whose life was built on calculated risks and hidden leverage, recognized a threat when he saw one. His first move was subtle. He made a sizable donation to the school's PTA, then used his newfound influence to raise concerns about a wealthy stranger spending so much time around the children. He painted Julian as an eccentric billionaire with an unhealthy fixation, planting seeds of doubt among the other parents. When that didn't work, Julian's quiet professionalism and genuine connection with the children had already won over the school staff. The Crofts escalated. They began to tighten their grip on Alara. Her trips were restricted to school runs and grocery shopping, always with a strict time limit. Beatrice would call her incessantly, demanding to know her whereabouts. They confiscated her old laptop, her only window to the outside world, under the guise of her spending too much time on it. They were trying to isolate her, to cut her off from her only potential ally. The atmosphere in the Croft house, already oppressive, became suffocating. Meanwhile, Julian's investigation was drilling down to the bedrock of the conspiracy. Arthur had moved past financial records and was now digging into the human element. He located the mechanic who had serviced the Van Cess car a week before the crash. The man had retired and moved out of state, but for the right price, his memory became remarkably clear. He confessed that Marcus Croft had paid him an exorbitant amount of cash to weaken the brake line, assuring him it would just cause a minor fender bender, enough to scare David Vance and make him miss a crucial meeting at Thorne Industries. The mechanic, plagued by guilt, had kept a record of the serial numbers on the bills Marcus had given him. The final piece of the puzzle lay deep in the Thorne Industries archives, a place Julian hadn't set foot in for years. It was a digital vault of old project files. Working with Arthur late into the night, they sifted through terabytes of data from the fraudulent construction project David had been investigating. There, buried under layers of falsified reports, they found the original, unaltered schematics and budget proposals. They proved, without a shadow of a doubt, that Marcus had been systematically replacing specified, high-grade materials with cheap, substandard substitutes, pocketing millions in the process. David's whistleblower report hadn't just been about money, it had been about safety. The building project was a public works facility. If it had been built to Marcus's fraudulent specifications, it could have eventually collapsed, endangering hundreds of lives. Marcus hadn't just killed David to save his career, he'd done it to cover up a crime that could have led to mass casualties. Julian knew he couldn't act alone. He needed Alara. She was the legal next of kin, the heart of the family he was trying to save. He needed her trust, her testimony. He arranged to meet her during her one sliver of freedom, the 30 minutes she had while the children were in their after-school music class. He saw her sitting alone on a park bench near the school, a solitary, forlorn figure. He approached her cautiously. "Alara," he said softly. She looked up, her eyes full of fear and distrust. "You need to stay away from us," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You don't know what they're like. They'll hurt you. They'll hurt the children." "I know exactly what they're like," Julian said, his voice firm but gentle. "And I know what they did to your parents." He proceeded to tell her everything, the embezzled trust fund, the sabotaged car, the fraud at his own company. He laid the ugly, brutal truth out before her. As he spoke, her fear began to morph into a dawning, horrified understanding. The vague suspicions she had harbored for years, the hushed phone calls she'd overheard, the financial statements that never made sense, it all clicked into place. The tears that streamed down her face were no longer tears of sorrow but of rage and grief. For the first time, she wasn't just a victim, she was a warrior. "I have proof," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. "I found a hidden ledger in his study a few months ago. I didn't know what it meant, but I knew it was important. I took pictures of every page with my old phone." She had the corroborating evidence they needed. In that moment, on that simple park bench, a powerful alliance was forged. Their newfound collaboration came not a moment too soon. Marcus Croft, sensing he was losing control, made his most dangerous move yet. He filed a formal petition with the family court for permanent legal guardianship of Liam and Lily. His petition was filled with slanderous lies about Alara, painting her as an unstable, irresponsible young woman incapable of caring for her siblings. His stated plan was to enroll them in a harsh, military-style boarding school in another state, a place that specialized in disciplining troubled youths. It was a clear and vicious threat. He would sever the bond between the siblings, destroying the last remnants of the Vance family forever. He delivered the threat to Alara personally, his voice a venomous whisper. "One more conversation with that man Thorne, and you will never see your brother and sister again. Do you understand me?" The stakes had been raised to an unbearable level. It was no longer about money or justice. It was about survival. The time for subtlety was over. Julian Thorne, a man who had built his empire on calculated aggression and overwhelming force, was about to bring the full weight of his power down on Marcus Croft. He arranged the confrontation on his own turf, the main boardroom on the top floor of Thorne Tower. It was a place designed to intimidate, a cathedral of corporate power with a single, massive oak table and a panoramic view of the city that seemed to put the whole world at your feet. Marcus arrived looking confident, even arrogant, clearly believing this was a negotiation, a chance to buy Julian's silence. He sat down opposite Julian, a smug smile on his face. "Julian," he began, leaning back in his chair. "I think there's been a misunderstanding. Let's talk about how we can make this problem go away. I'm sure we can find a number that makes everyone happy." Julian let him finish, his own face an unreadable mask of calm. Then he pressed a button on the console in front of him. A large screen descended from the ceiling. "There will be no negotiation, Marcus," Julian said, his voice deceptively soft. The screen flickered to life. The first image was a bank statement from an offshore account showing a deposit that matched the exact amount embezzled from the Vance Children's Trust. The next slide was a high-resolution photo of the tampered brake line from the Vance's car. Then came the sworn, videotaped testimony of the mechanic. Slide after slide, Julian laid out the case, a cold, methodical demolition of Marcus's life. He showed the fraudulent invoices, David Vance's original whistleblower report, and finally the pictures Alara had taken of the secret ledger, a detailed record of Marcus's criminal enterprise. Marcus's smugness evaporated, replaced by a pasty, slack-jawed horror. He was cornered, exposed, with nowhere to run. The arrogance, however, was a stubborn weed. When the presentation ended, a sneer twisted his lips. "You think you can prove any of this?" he spat. "And what if I did it? That fool David Vance would have ruined me. He would have destroyed everything my family built. I did what was necessary to protect my legacy, my position. Those children, that girl, they're nothing. Ungrateful baggage. They should be on their knees, thanking me for the roof I put over their heads." He showed no remorse, no flicker of shame. His justification was the raw, unvarnished creed of a sociopath, a man who saw other human beings as mere obstacles or tools. A cold, cleansing fury washed over Julian. He stood up, his towering height and sheer presence filling the room. "You talk about legacy," he said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal growl. "Your parents built a respectable name. You have burned it to the ground for greed. You murdered a good man, a brilliant engineer who was trying to save my company from your incompetence and fraud. You orphaned his children and subjected them to years of cruelty and neglect." He leaned across the table, his eyes boring into Marcus. "You are a parasite, Croft, and your legacy will be a concrete cell. I have already spoken to the district attorney. They are waiting for my call." He straightened up, his decision made. "As of this moment, you are fired from the board of this company. Your assets are frozen. Everything you stole, I will recover. And I will personally fund the prosecution to ensure you and your wife spend the rest of your miserable lives in prison." Without another word, Julian turned and left the boardroom, leaving Marcus to stew in the ruins of his life. He didn't look back. His next stop was far more important. He drove directly to the Croft house, his heart pounding with a mixture of anger and anxiety. He found Alara in her small, sparse room, frantically stuffing a few clothes into a worn-out backpack. The court summons for the guardianship hearing was crumpled on her bedside table. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with desperation. "He's going to take them," she sobbed. "I have to get them away from here." Julian knelt in front of her, taking her trembling hands in his. "You don't have to run anymore, Alara," he said, his voice firm but filled with a compassion he hadn't felt in years. He told her about the confrontation with Marcus, about the evidence, about the impending arrests. "It's over," he promised. "They can never hurt you or Liam and Lily again. I am going to find you a safe place to live. I will handle all the legal proceedings. I will protect you." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "Amelia would have wanted me to, and I want to. You are not alone in this anymore." For the first time, Alara looked at him not as a powerful benefactor or a mysterious stranger, but as an ally, a protector. The battle lines had been drawn, and for the first time she was not fighting alone. Marcus and Beatrice Croft's last stand was a monument to their own delusion. They proceeded with their annual charity gala, a lavish affair for the city's elite, held in the grand ballroom of a historic hotel. The event, ironically, was a fundraiser for a charity supporting underprivileged youth. It was their final, desperate attempt to project an image of untouchable social grace, to armor themselves with their reputation. They stood at the entrance, greeting powerful figures with dazzling smiles, completely unaware that their world was about to be publicly and irrevocably dismantled. Julian arrived, not in his usual tuxedo, but in a simple, dark suit that seemed to absorb the light around him. At his side was Alara. She wasn't wearing a borrowed gown, but a simple, elegant dress he had bought for her that afternoon. She looked poised and strong, her hand resting confidently in the crook of his arm. Liam and Lily were not with them. They were safely with Arthur at a nearby hotel suite, watching a movie, finally free from the oppressive atmosphere of their aunt and uncle's home. The sight of Julian Thorne with the maid, as many in the room knew her, sent ripples of murmurs through the crowd. The climax of the evening was Marcus's speech. He took the stage, basking in the spotlight, his voice smooth and practiced as he spoke of civic duty and the importance of caring for the less fortunate. "It is our responsibility," he declared, his gaze sweeping across the sea of wealthy faces, "to be guardians for those who cannot fend for themselves." As he paused for applause, the main doors of the ballroom swung open. 2 uniformed police officers, followed by 2 plainclothes detectives, walked in, their presence sucking the air out of the room. Before Marcus could react, Julian was on the stage, taking the second microphone from the podium. He didn't shout. His voice was calm, resonant, and carried to every corner of the silent ballroom. "Mr. Croft speaks of guardianship," Julian began, his eyes locked on Marcus's now panicked face. "So let's talk about the guardianship he provided for his own nephew and niece, Liam and Lily Vance." He turned to the stunned audience. "For the last year, this man and his wife have systematically embezzled the trust fund left to 2 orphan children. They subjected them to neglect and cruelty while living a life of luxury on stolen money. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Behind Julian, the large screens that had been displaying the charity's logo flickered to life. Arthur, from a control room, began projecting the evidence, bank transfers from the Children's Trust, Marcus's signature on the documents. But his crimes go much deeper than theft, Julian continued, his voice hardening. The children's father, David Vance, was an employee of my company. He was a man of integrity. And he was murdered. A collective shockwave went through the ballroom. The screens now showed the mechanic's report on the sabotaged brake lines, followed by David Vance's original whistleblower memo. Julian delivered the final, devastating blow. David Vance died because he was about to expose Marcus Croft for a massive fraud scheme that not only would have sent him to prison but also endangered the public. David wasn't just a victim, he was a hero. And the man who killed him wants you to applaud his philanthropy tonight. The detectives walked onto the stage. One of them placed a hand on a stunned, ashen-faced Marcus. Marcus Croft, you are under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, and suspicion of murder. The other detective approached Beatrice, who began to shriek, her carefully constructed mask of civility shattering into ugly, panicked rage. They were cuffed and led away through the crowd of their former friends, who now stared at them with a mixture of horror and revulsion. Their downfall was not a quiet affair, it was a spectacular, public immolation witnessed by the very society they had so desperately courted. Amid the flashing cameras and the chaos of the aftermath, Julian stepped down from the stage. He walked directly to Alara, who was standing near the entrance, watching the scene with a quiet, solemn vindication. He took her hand, ignoring the reporters shouting questions at him. He led her out of the ballroom, away from the wreckage of the Crofts' lives. In that moment, a silent promise passed between them. The past was over. The fight was won. They walked out into the cool night air, leaving the darkness behind, and for the first time in a very long time, stepped toward a future that was theirs to build. They were no longer just allies in a fight, they were the foundation of a new family, forged in adversity and united in the public eye, finally free. 9 months later, the world was a different place. The manicured lawns and cold marble of the Croft residence were a distant memory, replaced by the scent of freshly cut grass and the sound of children's laughter. Julian, Alara, Liam, and Lily now lived in a warm, sprawling farmhouse an hour outside the city, a house chosen not for its prestige, but for its enormous backyard and sturdy old oak tree perfect for a swing. The ghosts of the past had been laid to rest. Marcus and Beatrice Croft were serving long prison sentences, their assets seized and their names now a synonym for disgrace. Julian Thorne was a changed man. The billionaire tycoon who once commanded boardrooms with icy precision now sat on a plush rug on the living room floor, his brow furrowed in concentration. He was helping Liam construct an impossibly complex Lego fortress. The bespoke suits were gone, replaced by a soft, worn-out sweater and comfortable jeans. He had stepped down as CEO of Thorne Industries, promoting a trusted, brilliant executive to take his place. He remained on the board, but his days were no longer consumed by stock prices and profit margins. His new bottom line was happiness. In the corner, Lily was at a small easel, her tongue sticking out in concentration as she painted a vibrant, colorful picture. It was a portrait of the four of them standing in front of their new house, all of them smiling. Alara came in from the kitchen carrying a plate of cookies. She watched the scene, a quiet, contented smile on her face. The weary exhaustion that had been etched into her features for so long had been replaced by a radiant calm. She was no longer just a survivor, she was a guardian, a sister, a partner. She was thriving, enrolled in online university courses to finish the degree she had abandoned to care for her siblings. She was the heart of their new home. Julian's redemption was not just personal, it was public. Using his own fortune and every penny recovered from the Crofts, he had established the Vance Foundation for Child Protection. It was a powerful, well-funded organization that provided pro bono legal services and investigative support for children trapped in abusive guardianship situations. It was his tribute to David and Sarah, a way to ensure that their integrity and sacrifice created a legacy of safety for others. It was his final, definitive act of rejecting the cold, empty pursuit of wealth for its own sake and using his immense resources to heal the kind of wounds he had once been blind to. His new legacy was not one of glass and steel, but of hope and protection. Later that evening, after the children were asleep, Julian and Alara sat on the wide porch swing, the gentle creak a soothing rhythm in the quiet country night. He reached over and took her hand, his touch now as familiar and comforting as the house itself. I spent so many years building an empire, he said quietly, his gaze fixed on the star-dusted sky. I thought that was what it meant to be strong. I thought legacy was something you built out of concrete and stock certificates. He turned to her, his eyes full of a warmth she now knew so well. I was wrong. I didn't realize a home, a real one, was built with something else entirely. Alara leaned her head on his shoulder, her hand squeezing his. We built it together, she whispered. The next morning, Liam ran out onto the porch, his face glowing with pride. He was holding the completed Lego fortress, an intricate creation of towers and walls. We built a fortress, Julian, he announced. To keep everyone safe, Julian looked from the boy's triumphant face to Alara, who was watching them with love-filled eyes. A genuine, unrestrained smile spread across his face, reaching his eyes for what felt like the first time in a decade. He put his arm around the boy's shoulders, pulling him into a hug. Yes, we did, he said, his voice thick with emotion as he looked at Alara over Liam's head. The fortress wasn't made of plastic bricks. It was them. The real, unbreakable fortress was the family they had built together.